Hmm. Hi everyone. How are you? Hope you're all well. Hey Dolores. Hi Greg. How are you? Kay. Great to see you. Did you all hear what Keir Starmer is attempting to do to Corbyn in the UK? Well, I thought he already did it, that he purged Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party. Now, that's what I hear. Now, the question is whether Jeremy Corbyn has enough support to form his own party. That might be interesting. Carmen says, presents. Hi, good people. Well, I had to compete with Bernie again tonight. But he was doing another town hall. He's getting to be, he's on every night. Okay, so tonight I want to start off with some of the bad news and keep going. Okay, let's go to the pandemic first. So the coronavirus now, according to the Worldometer site, we've had 234,177 fatalities in the United States, so we're not far from going over 235,000. We should get there tomorrow because today we had 1,047 fatalities. We're up to 706 per million. Only 6 now in back, of Ecuador. In case you haven't noticed, we've been gaining, on Ecuador. It shouldn't take us more than 2 days to surpass them. They seem to have slowed down a bit in their fatality rates. So it looks like we'll be getting to where they are now very quickly. It's worth noting that yesterday we were at 703 deaths per million, and yesterday we had 1,030 deaths. And 2 days ago, we were at 1,055 fatalities, and we had 700 deaths per million. So over the last 3 days, including today, each day we've had more than 1,000 fatalities. So it seems like we're back up to that level now. And what does the future look like? Well, here we are at the chart for the reproduction rate. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have shared the other chart. But let me share what I do. Let me share the reproduction rate with you. It's quite striking. ERT, the reproduction number. See, out of the 51 jurisdictions, including DC, 49 of them are now in the red. In Maine, but just a couple of days ago, was still green, has gone up to 1.14, in the reproduction rate. It was at something like 0.97 just a couple of days ago. So there apparently has been an outbreak there, okay, in Maine. How high it will go, I don't know. But Hawaii is at 1.05. That's the lowest jurisdiction in the red. It's the lowest one. Now, there usually are a few jurisdictions that are 1.0, 1.01, 1.02. No, now the lowest of the red jurisdictions, the 49th, is at 1.05. Only two jurisdictions, two states, are under a reproduction rate of 1.00. In other words, only two have a reproduction rate that is under 1, which means the number of cases is slowing in those states. One is Oklahoma, which is at 0.99. So it seems like it may be about to go over 1. Could be, I don't know. And the other is actually Mississippi. They've been in the high 0.8s and low 0.9s for a few days now. So there you have it. The future looks bleak. Wyoming's at 1.34 and Vermont is at 1.34. Bernie's very state. Rhode Island, 1.29, 1.24 in Minnesota. Pennsylvania, 1.19, increasing cases in Pennsylvania. Interesting to note that here's Minnesota. Trump's been campaigning, in Minnesota, 1.24. I think Trump plans to stop in Iowa. They're already at 1.19 there. Of course, he's concentrating on Pennsylvania quite a lot. They're 1.19 in Pennsylvania right now. Looking bad for Pennsylvania. Michigan, 1.17. There's Wisconsin, 1.13. And Ohio, 1.16. So all the states that Trump is going to now to campaign in are high up there with respect to the reproduction rate. He, of course, is going to accelerate that when his campaign stops are super spreader events, as you all know. But to look at it from another point of view, if the cases are growing rapidly in those states, which they now are, as we are in the run-up to the election, only a few days left, that's going to be on people's minds. If they have not already voted and banked to vote, and they have to do in-person voting in the run-up to the election, COVID is getting worse. It all belies Trump's statements that we're turning the corner and that it's over, and whatever other lies he wants to tell on the campaign trail. Those lies will not square with the reality, and the newspapers and the TV stations are going to be covering the coronavirus. He won't stop them from covering the coronavirus. So that's going to be a background to the election in those states. Then we move to the economy. It's a Thursday, of course, so new jobs report, is available from Common Dreams. So let us share that. This is an article from Heidi Sherholtz at the Economic Policy Institute, written today. Let's be very clear, Senate Republicans have failed every struggling American family. and she lays it on the line. 1.1 million more people applied for unemployment insurance benefits last week, including 751,000 who applied for regular state unemployment insurance and 360,000 who applied for pandemic unemployment assistance. PUA is the federal program for workers who are not eligible for regular unemployment insurance, like the gig workers. Provides up to 39 weeks of benefits, but it's set to expire at the end of this year. The 1.1 million who applied for unemployment insurance last week was a decline of just 25,000 from the prior week's revised figures. Last week was the 32nd straight week. Total initial claims were far greater than the worst week of the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010. That comparison is restricted to regular state claims because we didn't have the PUA in the recession. The initial claims last week was still 3.7 times where they were a year ago. Most states provide 26 weeks of regular benefits. This crisis has gone on much longer than that. That means many workers are exhausting their regular state unemployment insurance benefits. In the most recent data, continuing claims for regular state unemployment insurance dropped by 709,000 from 8.5 million to 7.8 million. Fortunately, after an individual exhausts regular state benefits, they can move on to pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, PEUC, which is an additional 13 weeks of regular state unemployment insurance. However, in the latest data available for PEUC, the week ending October 10th, PEUC rose by just 387,000 to 3.7 million, offsetting only 42% of the 921,000 decline in continuing claims for regular state benefits for the same week. A small increase in PEUC relative to the decline in continuing claims for regular state unemployment insurance is likely due in large part, to delays workers are facing getting onto PEUC, including workers either not being told about PEUC or not being told they have to apply for it. States are required to notify eligible workers, but it may not be happening. Further, many of the roughly 2 million workers who were on unemployment insurance before this recession began, who are in states with less than 26 weeks of regular state benefits, are exhausting their PEUC benefits. DOL data suggests right now 23.8 million workers are either on unemployment benefits or have applied recently and are waiting to get approved. Okay, so this is an old story. It repeats every week. You know what it's about. The important thing now is that it's in the context of what's been happening, in politics. When these programs expire, millions of these workers and their families will be financially devastated. But there's little hope for another stimulus bill before next year, says Heidi Shierholz. The House passed a $2.2 trillion relief package, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell adjourned to the Senate on Tuesday. They went on another vacation with no COVID relief. The cruelty is mind-blowing. But blocking more stimulus is not just cruel, it's terrible economics. For example, the spending made possible by the extra $600 in UI was supporting millions of jobs. Letting the $600 expire means cutting those jobs. Not providing stimulus in the form of aid to state and local governments will also cost millions of jobs. The labor market is still more than 12 million jobs below where we would be if the recession hadn't happened, and job growth is slowing. Further GDP numbers were released this morning showing that GDP is now 3.5% below where it was at the end of 2019, the second largest three-quarter drop on record. It is shameful that the Senate Republicans are walking away from the American people like this. Blocking more stimulus also means no additional housing and nutrition assistance, no COVID-related health and safety measures for workers, no aid to the Postal Service during this critical time, no additional support for virus testing, tracing, and isolation measures or virus treatment, support for hospitals and other health providers. All of these things would have helped our economy and the people in it recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And then she goes on some more. But the bottom line is, further, workers in this pandemic aren't just losing their jobs. An estimated 12 million workers and their family members have lost employer-provided health insurance due to COVID-19. So, terrible news for the economy continues in terms of unemployment. But also, however, there is the GDP issue. Let us consider that for a moment. Let me go to the GDP issue. This is an article from the Center for Economic and Policy Research by Dean Baker. And it's called Preview What to Look For in the Third Quarter GDP Report. And he says, while we're virtually certain to see record growth for GDP in the third quarter, which we did see, without a new stimulus package, a drop is likely in the fourth quarter. And he predicted that the GDP growth would be close to 35%, okay, at an annual rate. It was 32%, okay, at an annual rate. So he knew what he was talking about. Trump was going out there touting the 32% that broke all records for growth and claiming a miracle, an economic miracle in his campaign, failing to tell people that this is a bounce back from a record plunge in the second quarter, which followed a sharp drop in the first quarter, which means that we're still at an extremely low level, okay, of GDP. The economy, he says, would have to grow at a 53.3% annual rate in the third quarter to make up the ground lost in the first and second quarters. Did not do that, as I just told you. It only went up by 32%. So, we didn't make it. We were not at all fully recovered. We're still way below where our GDP should be. Okay, it looks like there's an increase in expenditure in certain consumer goods and in food, strong spending on cars, and also store-bought food as a replacement for restaurant food. On the other hand, consumption of services such as healthcare, transportation, and recreation in restaurants was very hard hit. He says it would take annual growth rates of over 100% from the second quarter levels to make up the ground lost in these sectors. While we're likely to see very strong growth in all four categories, we will almost certainly still be far below the pre-pandemic level. And he was right. We were. This is a prediction which came true. Okay. So, I'm not going to go over this much more. I'm just going to point out that we still are in a disaster that was predicted by Dean Baker, and he was absolutely right, because that is what happened. And so, okay, I'm going to go away from this now as well. Okay. Stop sharing that. And next takes us to the election, to what's going on with the election. And this article in Common Dreams, October 29, 2020. Dangerously authoritarian, Trump says, quote, hopefully, unquote, courts will stop states from counting ballots after November 3rd. He's saying it out loud. He wants courts to block legally cast ballots from being counted. And this one was by Jake Johnson. Okay, that's a picture from Los Angeles County, and they're sorting ballots there that came in by mail at the mail-in ballot processing center at the Pomona Fairplex in Pomona, California, yesterday. Trump on Wednesday once again openly voiced hope that U.S. courts, now packed with his right-wing judges, which, by the way, Schumer offered little resistance all through this period to the 220 justices, including the 3 Supreme Court justices that were gotten in by Donald Trump. He did very little to resist. He refused to play rough. He refused to he refused to try to break things up in the Senate. In short, he was just a wimp throughout this whole time. Anything but a part of the resistance. He needs to go. Anyway, Trump called upon his right-wing judges to intervene and stop states from counting legally submitted ballots after November 3rd. Remarks that came just before the U.S. Supreme Court suggested it could invalidate late-arriving Pennsylvania votes after Election Day. Quote, hopefully the few states remaining that want to take a lot of time after November 3rd to count ballots that won't be allowed by the various courts because, as you know, we're in courts on that, Trump said during a press conference in Las Vegas. Trump went on to tout as a big victory, quote unquote, the Supreme Court's ruling earlier this week, barring Wisconsin from extending its absentee ballot deadline past November 3rd at 8 p.m. local time. Quote, the president is essentially saying he will litigate to try and stop the count of absentee ballots, the count of which is never completed on Election Day. That was tweeted by Sherilyn Ifill, the daughter of Gwen Ifill, who died a couple of years ago, but who was on PBS for years and years and years, very well known. She's the president and director counsel of the NAACP, the Legal Defense and Educational Fund. According to one estimate, quote, about 10% of all votes cast in the 2016 election were counted after Election Day. It's not unusual. Quote, also, when is he imagining that the military mail-in votes will be counted, unquote, asked Ifill. Quote, he is trying to make this sound normal. It's not. Of course it's not. The military ballots have to be counted. Absentee ballots certainly should be counted if they were postmarked, if they have a postmark, okay, earlier than Election Day, okay, or by Election Day. President's comments came shortly before the Supreme Court late on Wednesday permitted North Carolina and Pennsylvania to extend their arrival deadlines for mail-in ballots, blocking Republican efforts to require strict Election Day a deadline. So the court backed off a little in that particular decision. But as Common Dreams reported, the High Court left open the possibility of invalidating late arriving Pennsylvania ballots shortly after the election. Conservative Justice Samuel Alito, joined by Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, said he only, quote, reluctantly, unquote, denied the Pennsylvania GOP's push for the rejection of ballots that arrive after Election Day, and said the High Court would take up the case again after November 3rd. Well, we'll see what happens after November 3rd. But I'll bet if they propose to do that after November 3rd, there are going to be a lot of people out on the streets in front of the Supreme Court. And maybe it's one of the only times they're going to see that large a showing of people outside of the Supreme Court. Quote, Supreme Court may throw out ballots that arrive after Election Day, even though they are valid under current law, warned Slate's Mark Joseph Stern, unquote. Quote again, do not mail your ballot, drop it off, or vote in person. Don't leave your vote in the hands of the Supreme Court. And I cannot emphasize that heavily enough myself. But now I want to ask a question before we go to the next part, okay, of this. Obviously, you have a party which now for years has been engaged in efforts to trying to suppress votes, to stop people from exercising their right to vote, even when they have a legal right to vote in their states. So my question is, why aren't people voting against Republicans just because they want to end your ability, our ability, to kick them out? Why would people vote for any Republicans when they know that these Republicans will go along with efforts to prevent the voters from kicking them out when we tire of them? The most important feature of democracy, in fact, the very definition of democracy, according to Karl Popper, was the ability of the people to change their governments, to change the people who were making up laws and rules for them. That was his criterion for democracy. The Republicans are proposing to end that particular criterion. They'll end it whenever they get a chance, whenever it favors them. So why would anybody who wants to have the continuing ability to throw their legislators out, their presidents out, why would anybody vote for a party that wants to end their ability to do that? Didn't we fight for that right for hundreds of years? Why are we so ready now to vote for people who stand ready to take that right away from us? That applies to all kinds of groups inside of our population. Why would they vote for people who, once they get in, will do anything to make themselves invulnerable to be voted out? I don't understand that. But I'm going to point out here that if that ability ends to the extent that voting is suppressed, to the extent there is gerrymandering, to the extent that one party is fooling around in order to deny people the vote, that party is leaving no option to people who become dissatisfied other than to use violence in order to remove governments that they don't like. Why do we have voting in the first place? Voting is for keeping the peace. That's what it's there for. What the Republicans are proposing to do is to revert to a system where the only recourse for discontented people is to arm themselves and overthrow the government. That's what they're doing. Why would anybody vote for them? I don't understand that. I just don't understand. Okay. Having asked that question, let us go on to the next phase of the coming crisis. Hopefully not, but maybe, that we are in. And this is the feature post of the evening. It's entitled "The U.S. Presidential Election, Managing the Risks of Violence," and it is an article by the International Crisis Group, the ICG. It's a report from the ICG. It starts, "What's new? As the U.S. presidential election approaches, the ingredients for unrest are present. The electorate is polarized. Both sides frame the stakes as existential. Violent actors could disrupt the process, and protracted contestation is possible. President Donald Trump's often incendiary rhetoric suggests he will more likely stoke than calm tensions. Why does it matter? Beyond the implications for any Americans caught up in unrest, the election will be a harbinger of whether its institutions can guide the United States safely through a period of socio-political change. If not, the world's most powerful country could face a period of growing instability and increasingly diminished credibility abroad. What should be done?" they ask. The authorities should be ready to counter voter intimidation and continue polling in the event of a disruption. It's nice to say that. Are they ready? Are the authorities ready to counter voter intimidation? Are the federal authorities ready when the president seems to be in favor of voter intimidation and seems to be in favor of not continuing polling in the event of disruption? Do we know whether the Supreme Court will be ready to issue injunctions against voter intimidation, and whether they will be willing to continue polling? Or will they stop counting as they did in Florida and give space for what can only be described as a coup d'etat in the election of 2000? The fact that Gore agreed to the coup d'etat makes it no less a coup d'etat. When they stop counting votes, folks, it's a coup d'etat. Domestic leaders should make bipartisan calls for a clean election. Foreign leaders should press U.S. counterparts to respect democratic norms. The media and foreign governments should take care not to recognize a winner prematurely. Here's an executive summary. As the 3rd of November U.S. presidential election approaches, the country faces an unfamiliar danger. While Americans have grown used to a certain level of rancor in these quadrennial campaigns, they have not, in living memory, faced the realistic prospect that the incumbent may reject the outcome or that armed violence may result. Actually, I think we faced a little bit of that in 2016, but since Trump was successful, since he won, the threat actually never materialized. But if you recall, he refused to say he would accept the results at that time, and there were right-wingers mobilizing at that time to help. Now, of course, I think the threat is far worse now, but that has changed in 2020 because of the emergence of risk factors that will spell trouble in any country. First is the political polarization bound up with issues of race and identity. Then the rise of armed groups with political agendas. Next, the higher than usual chances of a contested outcome. And most importantly, President Donald Trump, whose toxic rhetoric and willingness to court conflict to advance his personal interests have no precedent in modern U.S. history. The risk of unrest may ebb and flow as the final days of the campaign unfold, but it is almost certain to remain, and it will increase if either side forms the impression that the vote has been rigged. At some level, it should not be surprising that the United States now faces the specter of electoral violence. The U.S. has seen slavery, civil war, lynching, labor strife, and ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples. The wounds of those legacies have never fully healed. The country is awash in firearms, has gun homicide levels unmatched by any other high-income country, and is home to a white supremacy movement that, as discussed below, is growing in virulence. Racial injustice, economic inequality, and police brutality are common sources of tension, which periodically bubbles over into large-scale peaceful demonstrations and sometimes civil unrest. By way of recent example, the police killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, in Minnesota State's largest city of Minneapolis on the 25th of May generated a wave of protests and counter-protests that has diminished but not fully subsided 5 months later. One of the reasons why it's not fully subsided is the police keep on killing black men, as they did a few days ago in Philadelphia when Walter Wallace was killed by a policeman, which has created a wave of protests in Philly and violence. Even so, it is rare that U.S. elections threaten to go off the rails in a way that calls into question the capacity and resilience of the country's democratic institutions, or that suggests the use or threat of force might influence the outcome. Journalists and historians commonly cite 2 previous elections that the 2020 contest would come to resemble. The 2000 election was so close the winner was not apparent on election day. The Supreme Court halted a recount in Florida, handing the presidency to George W. Bush. As we know today, the president should have been Al Gore because he came out in a recount that was done after the election, sponsored by newspapers. He came out some 500 to 600 votes ahead. The 1876 election was so contentious that 4 states sent rival states of electors to Congress. In neither case, however, did the dispute wind up violent. Bush's opponent, Al Gore, accepted the Supreme Court decision, while in 1876, one candidate basically traded the White House to the other for an end to federal occupation of the South after the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. That's when the Civil War was. I never understood that. I never understood why Tilden gave in to Hayes for the sake of ending the occupation of the South, because Tilden was the governor of New York. So I was never sure why he cared about whether the occupation of the South was going to continue. Maybe he was a segregationist or something. Who knows? Anyway, under the circumstances, the responsibility of all officials at every level of government, of foreign partners, of civil society, and of the media should be to anticipate sources of friction and grievance in the voting public and move quickly to address them. That may be the responsibility of all officials at every level of government, but they may not see that as their responsibility. Some will probably see it as their responsibility, but others will see that what they want to do is to stir up further friction and further grievance and further conflicts. In the limited time that remains before the election, state and local governments should acquaint themselves thoroughly with the legal tools at their disposal, and with support from civil society, use them as needed so that voting and ballot counting can proceed in an orderly fashion without duress. So traditional and social media should take extra precautions not to pronounce winners prematurely, particularly in battleground states where margins are likely to be thin. They must not provide a platform for candidates to declare themselves victors before the outcome is known, or to proliferate pernicious disinformation. Some have taken steps in this direction, but the challenge will require constant management. For their part, foreign heads of state should refrain from offering their congratulations until the institutional process has run its course, regardless of any potential pressure from the U.S. to do otherwise. If events take an ugly turn, both domestic and political and foreign leaders with easy access to Trump and his inner circles should tell them privately and publicly that they will have no support if they try to interfere with tabulation of results, or should they lose the peaceful transfer of power. In the interim, the U.S. political leaders at every level should follow the lead of the 2 Utah state gubernatorial candidates who recently recorded a public service announcement in which they jointly commit to peacefully upholding the democratic process. Ideally, more leaders representing the country's 2 major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, would get together ahead of the vote to make similar public pledges. The failure of democratic institutions to deliver a peaceful election, and depending on the result, transfer of power in the United States, would be bad for the American people, for the governance of the country, for the nation's credibility and thus its influence abroad, and for foreign partners who, even after 4 years of Trump, still turn to the U.S. for a measure of stability and security. With luck and perhaps a little help from its friends, the U.S. could still avoid election trouble and emerge ready to begin repairing the social fractures that helped to bring it to this dangerous place. And here's a video from the crisis group, which I'm not going to play And then the rest of the piece is a relatively lengthy, it's a report, as I said, amplification in detail of the executive summary. I'll go over it and pick out some salient points as I scroll through. Let's see if they have anything to say about Tilden and why he gave in. He agreed to step aside in a fateful deal to pull federal troops out of the South and abandon the protection of recently freed slaves, spelling the beginning of the Jim Crow period. This bargain, while it certainly led to violence down the road, also averted a prolonged constitutional crisis that could have produced armed clashes around the election itself. The report explores the factors that have made the 2020 presidential election potentially dangerous. And they go on, explain why this year is so different, a polarized electorate, high stakes that both sides see or portray as existential, the proliferation of hate speech and misinformation through social and other media, pre-existing ethno-sectarian or racial tensions, allegations of cheating or a will to cheat in order to win, coupled with a conviction among many on both sides that a loss is possible only in the event of fraud, distrust of institutions organizing the vote or resolving disputes, highly segregated and mutually mistrusted sources of information, the existence of armed non-state actors, specifically militias with easy access to weapons, the prospect of narrow electoral margins in a contested outcome, an incumbent who sees personal, legal, or financial interests at stake in the preservation of loss of power, and a political leadership that fuels divisions rather than diffuses them. Okay, and by the way, in the next to last of those particular factors, we see one reason why no one should be allowed into the presidency who does not divest themselves of their financial interests before they come in, and of their legal problems before they come in. Candidates should be thoroughly vetted for those and required to divest themselves immediately, because Trump has kept his financial interests all through the presidency, and they're at stake now. They're at stake if he's not elected. That's an extra motivation for him to stay in and to contest things. And because he did all manner of illegal things before he came into the White House, he has personal legal interests at stake now, because when he leaves, he's likely to be prosecuted. And that gives him a great incentive to want to stay in the White House at all costs. So that's why the framers of the Constitution were wise in this respect. They tried, what they tried to do is to specify constitutional requirements for people who would ascend to the presidency, so they didn't have conflicts of interest of this sort. That's why the emoluments clauses of the Constitution are so important, and why it was terrible when we allowed Donald Trump to violate those clauses for all the years he has been in the presidency. The presence of these risk factors, to go on with the report, all of which to some degree feature in this year's pre-electoral landscape in the United States, not in every case mean that conflict or serious violence is inevitable or even likely. But ahead of the forthcoming election, four of these factors are particularly prominent. Each is cause for concern in itself, but it is the confluence of them that makes the 2020 election especially worrying. And of course, there's the polarization and the progeny, okay, of the polarization. And they talk here about the polarization coming from the conflicts of the 1960s and the 1970s, civil rights movements, the women's rights movements, the LGBTQ plus movements took off and percolated from grassroots up. And of course, the initial success, okay, of the progressive movements and the reaction to it by the conservatives. In short, Donald Trump used the language of grievance and division to harness the polarization, okay, but the division was already there, deeply rooted in decades of U.S. social, cultural, and political life, and we might add also political and cultural change. And they talk about the Democrats. For example, over the past quarter century, the Democratic Party has grown more ethnically diverse and decreasingly religious. It has moved to the ideological left on racial and moral justice issues. Support for the Black Lives Matter racial justice among Democrats is high, for instance. By comparison, polling suggests that core support for the Republican Party comes from white evangelicals, white men without a college education, rural Southerners, weekly religious service attendees, and Gen X men, i.e. men who are between 25 and 38 years old, in 2003. And also particularly since Trump's emergence as his leader, the Republican Party has embraced a platform of economic nationalism, also protectionism, immigration restrictionism, and deep nostalgia for a real or imagined era of national greatness, evoked by the MAGA slogan. The substantial majority of Republican voters do not support the Black Lives Matter movement. The differences between the two major U.S. political parties are magnified in rhetoric that can only reinforce a deep sense of the divisions. So I'll skip over this next part, but you get the picture of the polarization factor. Second factor is armed groups. Our failure over the years to do anything about the prevalence of guns, okay, in our culture, to control those. So that's a factor there. The sense of grievance and alienation that has driven the U.S. to its increasing levels of the polarization has also created an environment in which non-state groups, cells, and actors, some of whom adopt paramilitary trappings, pose an increasing security risk. And they talk here, of course, about the rightists, and Trump also suggesting the more significant threat comes from Antifa. And the government's own analysts, as well as numerous other experts whom Crisis Group interview, tell a different story. The Department of Homeland Security concludes that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Okay. But that doesn't change the fact that there's disagreement. The Trumpists think the biggest threat to the homeland is Antifa. Everybody else thinks it's the extremist groups on the right. Some experts note they have been warning for some time about the potency of white nationalism arguing that it should be seen as part of a significant movement with the capacity to threaten democratic institutions of the United States. University of Chicago professor describes this movement as emerging after the Vietnam War and uniting remnants of the Ku Klux Klan with neo-Nazi, skinhead, and other activists. Yes, of course, people came home from the Vietnam War, and not at all a majority of people, but a minority of them went into these militias. They organized. There had been armed groups before. I even remember some when I was in graduate school, in Michigan. And there was a radical right as far back as that, and these people were arming themselves as far back as that. That was in the period from 1955 to 1960. So it goes back even before 1960, in my memory. But it did accelerate after the Vietnam War ended, because so many were dissatisfied at the result, in the Vietnam War, and at the fact that we had, by that time, failed to win the two post-World War II wars that we had engaged in, specifically the Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War. Of course, in the Korean War, we at least were able to fight it to a stalemate, but many people would argue that the Vietnam War was lost by the United States, and some group of veterans that came back felt that as a grievance, that the whole policy of fighting limited wars on the part of the government was a mistaken policy. Anyway, we have the right groups. The article says, if skepticism about the threat posed by armed right-wing groups has diminished among government experts and national security specialists, in large part because the profile, activity, and public assertiveness of these groups has surged since Trump emerged as a national political figure in the 2016 campaign. So they trace the emergence of these groups as a serious threat to the campaign, to the activation by Trump, and the fact that the strongly anti-government orientation and the ethno-nationalist dimensions of Trump's agenda have visibly resonated with the movement. So we have that. The Oath Keepers here, are mentioned as being ready to come at the beck and call, of Donald Trump. The Charlottesville demonstration, the killing, of Heather Heyer is mentioned. Kyle Rittenhouse, is mentioned. His murder, of two demonstrators for racial justice in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in August. And Trump's call to the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by when he was invited to condemn them during his debate with Joe Biden on September 29th, only a month ago now. So the armed groups are at the ready as far as we know. The report says, what role the militias will play in the U.S. election is unknown. Some election officials have expressed concern that President Trump's tweeting requesting an, quote, army, unquote, of poll watchers to guard against election rigging might lead the militias to engage in voter intimidation on November 3rd. But it's not clear how sizable a response this call will generate. Early voting at polling sites appears to be proceeding without a major incident thus far, or where exactly it might actually manifest itself. More generally, where and whether violence on election day or in its aftermath erupts could turn on any number of variables that will unfold in real time. This might include whether a resonant voice on social media networks favored by these groups sounds an alarm, captures their collective imagination about purported voter fraud at a certain location, or if there is a confrontation between the far right and other fringe groups at one location and news spreads, but triggering activists to intervene at other locations. Also references to Antifa activity, real or imagined, particularly potent rallying cries for many right-wing street fighters. At present, however, at least some in the movement prefer instead to focus attention on what they believe the left has in store, particularly if Trump is reelected. One prominent figure from the movement told Crisis Group that he believes that if Trump wins, quote, the violence from the left is going to make what has been going on look like kindergarten, unquote. So they're expecting violence from the left if Trump should win. I'm not sure about that. Of course, if he wins through rigging or something like that, there certainly will be protests and demonstrations from people who are left. Whether there will be violence is another question. It appears the states facing the greatest risk of activity by militias around the election include Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Oregon. Now, Oregon is not a swing state, so I wonder why the militia would represent a problem there. They might try to intimidate people on election day, but there would certainly be counter-protests to that. And also in Oregon, people might have been careful to vote as early as possible. So the vote there might already be in the bank for Joe Biden. Also, mail-in voting, in Oregon is will be a big factor in that particular campaign, and that's going to proceed in an orderly fashion. That is, the counting of those ballots is going to proceed in an orderly fashion. So I'm not sure I look to militia activity in Oregon over the next few days, but Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are all contested states right now. Trump himself seems not to plan to be campaigning in Georgia anymore, but to concentrate on the Rust Belt states. Joe Biden, though, is down in Georgia now, and I guess is going to close the campaign in Georgia and Florida, and maybe go to Arizona. I don't know if... no, I think Joe Biden does plan to go to Michigan as well. So anyway, those states may be centers of disruption. And the report says these findings take into account, among other things, the extent to which a location has seen substantial engagement in anti-coronavirus lockdown protests, attracted the attention of right-wing groups because of ostensible anti-Trump coup, quote-unquote, activities, e.g. a racial justice demonstration, has law enforcement personnel with personal relationships with militia members, and or is a closely contested state for electoral purposes where voter suppression could be effective in tilting the results. The prospect of a contested election, though neither guaranteed nor necessarily highly likely, emerges from two primary factors. First, the U.S. electorate is fairly evenly divided between the two major political parties. And they go through the history of that. And then they say, secondly, the complex, layered, and somewhat ambiguous rules that govern the presidential elections create numerous such openings. To a great extent, these are a function of the antiquated electoral college system. Under the U.S. Constitution, presidents are selected not by direct popular vote, but by electors representing each state and the District of Columbia, which by constitutional design is not incorporated into any state. Moreover, as a constitutional matter, the right to select those electors does not rest directly with the people of each state. Rather, under the U.S. Constitution, the electors are chosen by each state in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. All 50 of the U.S. states and District of Columbia have enacted laws that cause electors to be allocated in accordance with the popular vote. Normally, it is up to officials in the state's executive branch, to appoint electors based on the popular vote outcome. But as discussed below, there could be circumstances potentially relevant in a contested election in which a legislature claims the right to claw back that power, e.g. because of claims that the vote count has been tainted by fraud. Theoretically, it is therefore possible that the different branches of state government could send two different electoral slates to Congress. And there we go. Here's a paragraph that's a little different. Adding to the complexity is the Electoral Count Act of 1887, a complex statute enacted by Congress in the aftermath of the Hayes-Tilden deadlock of 1876. The Act creates certain incentives and deadlines to help make sure that the electoral process produces a winner well in advance of the end of the current presidential term, which the Constitution says takes place at noon on the 20th of January. Actually, it used to take place in March, but the date was changed to the 20th of January. I'm not sure that was done by constitutional amendment. I guess it had to be done by constitutional amendment, so it probably was. By way of motivation for states to move quickly in counting votes and cleaning up disputes, the Act provides that if a state determines its electoral slate by an early December safe harbor date, 8th of December 2020, in accordance with laws in force, but before Election Day, then Congress is required to defer to that determination. It also provides that on the 14th of December, the electors must convene in state capitals to cast their votes for president. Finally, it creates procedures for the newly constituted Congress to formally count the electoral votes that have been cast on the 6th of January. In a year where the prospect of contestation looms large, these and other dates are significant, among other things, because they serve a forcing function, ultimately motivating and requiring states to move with some alacrity through the process of counting ballots and to resolve any disputes about concerning the validity of those ballots. These dates are also important because they have the potential to cut off processes that may represent the path to victory for one of the candidates. In the context of 2000 elections, the Supreme Court's decision to end the Florida recount, closing off Al Gore's prospects and handing the win to George W. Bush, was based on its finding that the recount could not be duly concluded before the safe harbor date. So, there's much that can go wrong, with all this, and in some of the previous of our live streams, we've covered that. But, of course, it's a reminder that all the while this is going on, tensions between the two sides could both build and become more dangerous, particularly if activists stage mass demonstrations to pressure one or the other candidate to back down. Then there's the fourth factor, the Trump factor. Perhaps the most concerning risk factor is President Trump himself. While electoral politics at the presidential level are fierce and sometimes dirty, Trump's style of divisive rhetoric and action has no parallel in modern U.S. history. There are multiple facets of his record spell potential trouble in the event of a close or contested election. And then they go through his reaction to militia activity over the course of his 4 years and his tendency to minimize its importance and offer cryptic statements which can be viewed as a form of support. Also, he shows very little deference to norms that have insulated the military from domestic political affairs or respect the judgment of local officials about how to police their own states and cities. We know that. We've seen it. Okay, there's a Lafayette Square Park thing. There's an attempt to get the support of the military, okay, in that, which he failed to do in the end. He subsequently sent non-military federal security forces to Portland, Oregon, over the objection of local authorities, and to other cities over the objection of those cities. Finally, Trump's statements with respect to the election itself betrayed inclination to delegitimize any loss and to seek advantage through words and deeds that disenfranchise the Democratic electorate. And of course, we're seeing that now. We see it every day in the campaign. There's the army, okay, of poll watchers that he has called out, and there, of course, are stand back and stand by stuff. And he's also repeatedly refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power if the vote does not go his way, unquote, from the article. Of course, but nobody knows how far he's going to go. We have to wait and see. But we can expect that it's going to be a very tense period, especially since it looks like he's going to lose substantially in this period as the election comes closer. So there's variations on 3 themes in terms of negative scenarios, 3 potential scenarios. There might be monitoring of polling stations and other sites, okay, by armed men, poll watchers who are armed, intimidating voters. While trained poll watchers are normally citizens who monitor polling places to provide an extra measure of comfort, experts worry that Trump's use of martial language will signal a desire of supporters untrained in poll watching to strike an intimidating posture to deter Democratic voting. In some cities, activists are reportedly already making plans to patrol the polling places. While by itself, this phenomenon could have a troubling suppressive effect, things could be compounded greatly in many ways. For example, armed men or other Trump supporters might travel en masse to predominantly Democratic urban districts and battleground states, ostensibly to protect the vote or the vote count, and wind up disrupting it, as noted above, based on crisis group's conversation with present and former militiamen. The likelihood they would heed a call to congregate in this way could increase if accounts began to circulate on social media that Antifa protesters were on the scene. Journalist Barton Gellman spelled out one arguably worst-case scenario for how this might unfold, and they quoted from the Gellman article. It could be actually exacerbated if the president were to declare, an emergency and send federal personnel in battle dress to restore law and order, and then they close the streets that lead to the polls. They take custody of uncounted ballots in order to preserve evidence of fraud, and incidentally, do not therefore count those ballots. So votes are uncounted in urban areas where Democrats are strong. Then there could be delegitimization and disqualification of mail-in ballots because of the enormous split between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to mail-in voting, with half full Democrats surveyed in August saying they would like to vote by mail versus only 1/4 Republicans. Large-scale disqualification of mail-in votes almost certainly would favor President Trump's chances. Except, since then, he's disrupted things by fooling around with the post office, and so then many people who were going to vote by mail have decided instead to early vote, that was safer. For example, we decided to early vote that just for that particular reason. We didn't want to take a chance on the post office. Many other people have felt the same way, and that's why the early votes that have arrived now constitute, I believe, more than 70 million ballots already, perhaps by now getting close to 80 million ballots, which is predicted to be half the turnout for this campaign. That's the early votes. By necessity, many of the mailed ballots will be tallied after the 3rd of November. Some key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin have laws that prohibit officials from counting such ballots before Election Day. Because of the volume and labor required, the count is likely to take days, if not weeks, following Election Day to complete. So that's very problematic under the present situation. And then, of course, there's the role of the likely newly appointed conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett if this gets into litigation and it reaches the U.S. Supreme Court. Of course, the Democrats have absolutely no faith in the objectivity of Coney Barrett, and she failed to commit to recuse herself from election-related cases during her confirmation hearing. Should she be the deciding vote in favor of President Trump, the result could well be seen as illegitimate by Democrats, fueling their sense of grievance. It would certainly be seen as illegitimate by myself, sufficiently illegitimate to want to resist such a finding and such a handing of the result to Trump. In fact, I would say if that is in the offing, there should be an attempt through mass protest to force her to recuse herself. And then there's the manipulation of deadlines. Finally, the deadlines imposed by the Electoral Count Act create opportunities for manipulation. And Republican operatives, were reported to be discussing them, scenarios that focus on this theme, take into account, that the December deadlines imposed under the Act, the 8th and 14th of December in 2020, create an imperative for states to certify electoral slates and send them to Congress by that time. These deadlines could be used in theory as a pretext to truncate the counting of mail-in ballots that might shift the battleground state from the Trump to the Biden column. The converse is also possible, but less likely, if nothing else, because of the extent to which the mail-in ballots are likely to favor Democrats. Of course, I don't think we really know that this is true right now. That was the expectation as of August. But we don't know that the mail-in ballots are predominantly Democratic right now, because it may be Democrats had migrated to early voting and we're leaving the mail-in ballots to the Republicans. We don't know how that actually worked out. So, there's that. Now we come to recommendations and conclusions. There are reasons to believe in the resilience of our institutions, says the crisis group, because there are guardrails. One is the apolitical military. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, has signaled very clearly that he will resist any efforts to draw it into an electoral dispute. Though the president controls other security forces and state governors control some National Guard units, the national military's non-involvement remains important. The second source of the resilience is the decentralization of electoral administration, which, while creating myriad opportunities for foul play, also provides some insurance against a coordinated manipulation. Third is that the American people, for all their polarization, have not entirely lost confidence in the system. Notwithstanding anxiety about modes of voting this year, at least some polling suggests that most early voters are confident that their ballots will be accurately counted. That's probably a fair description of the current situation. Fourthly, there's a well-articulated framework of federal, state, and local laws to protect election integrity and fend off intimidation. Fifthly, the press and civil society remain independent. Well, I wouldn't say that, but they're independent of Trump, let's put it that way, have all provided meaningful checks on executive power during this administration and are highly focused on violence prevention efforts. Perhaps more significant than any of these institutional features, however, is a circumstantial one in the narrative that has begun to set in among some Republicans that Trump, could lose. Senators Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, and Ben Sasse have all speculated about it, that leading Republicans are entertaining this prospect without actually delegitimizing the election could make it more difficult for Trump to argue that the Biden team cheated its way to victory if the election does not go his way. It could also suggest that these Republican leaders are concluding that they would be ill-served by a prolonged electoral challenge when it appears their candidate has lost. So it would be a mistake for those interested in U.S. stability to assume things will go smoothly on and following the 3rd of November. The risks are too significant, the negative scenario is too realistic, and the potential too great for unrest that damages the confidence in democratic institutions. And yes, of course, that's very, very true. I'm almost done, but I'm not going to finish the whole thing. You're getting the picture. Okay, the significance of this is that it comes from an international crisis group, an external group to the United States, talking about the integrity of our elections and the dangers posed. To my knowledge, this is the first time that has ever happened, and it previews, it presages the possible loss of tremendous international prestige on the part of the United States if this turns into a protracted crisis, and if the United States degenerates into very dangerous civil violence. The final paragraph of the report says, finally, whether or not the U.S. dodges a bullet by this election day, it will need over the longer term to confront and address the factors, big and small, that brought it to this point. Some of these may be technical matters as simple as changing the state-level rules that govern the counting of mail-in ballots, that the process can begin earlier and be completed in a timelier way. Others will likely involve dedicating more resources to addressing the traditionally under-examined threat posed by violent white supremacy organizations. But the bigger issues go far deeper and relate to the polarization that is torn at the social and political fabric of a fast-changing country. Whether U.S. leaders and democratic institutions are up to the enormous challenge of bringing the polls closer together remains to be seen. Navigating the 2020 presidential election with a minimum of unrest would be a step in the right direction, which of course is all true. But I'm not sure the report successfully takes into account the current situation of turmoil here in the United States due not only to the factors it discussed, but also to the coronavirus and the tensions created by the coronavirus and the economic dislocations aided and abetted by the political system that have been caused by the coronavirus. All that is creating major tensions in the United States that do not exist in some other countries where the payrolls of people and their livelihoods have been protected during this crisis so they don't have the economic worries, and also where they, even though they have worries about the coronavirus and whether medical care will be effective, they at least know that the medical care they have to get is not going to bankrupt them. Here, we don't know that. People as individuals have to confront that, and it makes them very, very vulnerable to mass movements. It makes them very, very vulnerable to participating in civil strife, and civil violence because of the anger and the despair and the grievances that everyone has. Now, this report has focused on the grievances of the right, I shouldn't say the grievances of the right wing, but the fact that they feel aggrieved by the processes of political and social change that have occurred. But it's not simply the right wing. It's people in general who have been subject to these neoliberal processes of social and economic change, which have discomfited the heavy majority of the population these days. Very few people now feel secure in any groups, and civil disorder and civil violence, it's very hard to say how this is going to work out. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to be ready for what we may have to do after the election, post-election. We have to be ready for what Trump could try to do. We have to be ready for possible unexpected reactions from institutions, within our society. Even though the military has said that it won't engage in politics in this country, people in the military have also taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. When and if they see Trump absolutely violating the Constitution of the United States, they'll have a conflict, because their oath doesn't just mean, it has meant, as a general matter, that they don't interfere in domestic politics. But they won't have had a situation before where, to stay in power, the president involved is violating the Constitution. If that happens, their oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, domestic and foreign, comes into play. And what they will do then is, I believe, an open question. I'm not at all sure that they're going to support Trump, in that instance. And the retired military have a great role to play too, because all those retired senior officers, of course, have contact with the current senior officers. They belong to social groups with norms and with a great emphasis on defending and protecting the Constitution. We don't know how these things, are going to work out. We are stepping into the unknown. The best protection against the unknown at this point is as big a victory as Biden can get both popular vote victory and, in addition, electoral college vote victory. If there is no question, in spite of all the shenanigans, that Biden has won as of November 3rd, or as of a few days after that anyway, then it is less and less likely that there will be support for any contestation by Donald Trump. And I think that is what we have to hope for. Anyway, I am now going to move to your comments. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. Thank you for sharing. I see more people have arrived. I'm sure that is due to your sharing. Okay, so. And Gregory Mallett said, as of 9:13, actually Steve Wolfbrand said, howdy, partner, at 9:12. And Greg Mallett said, I've been very busy doing volunteer work for the Biden campaign lately. Talk about a very fun experience. Has it been a fun experience? Well, that's encouraging because you're in Georgia. So if that was a fun experience, that's good. How are things looking in Georgia, Greg, from your vantage point? Carmen says, Bernie is like Timex. He takes a licking and keeps on ticking, as my grandma used to say. Yeah. He gave up in terms of the big fight, but he doesn't give up in terms of the everyday fight. He keeps on fighting. He takes a licking and he keeps on ticking. That's right, Carmen. Where is Florida on the graph, please? I will share I'll share that once again, and we'll see exactly where Florida is. I don't think Florida is doing as badly as some places. It was okay until a few days ago. Virginia is at 1.07, the state I live in. Texas is at 1.06. They're not doing too badly. Florida is a good deal worse at 1.11. That's getting into heavy weather there. Okay, a little heavy weather. Kentucky is in a bad place now. They're at 1.19. They're one of the states that could see lower totals for Trump. Of course, they're totally red. Everybody expects Trump is going to totally sweep it, okay, and everything else. But, they can go Democratic sometimes. They did elect a governor who's Democratic. It was a close race, but they did elect him. Statewide, they can go Democratic. If they're real pissed off about the coronavirus at this point, Kentucky looks bad. But anyway, that's where Florida is. Yeah, you can see me with my pointer on Florida right there, 1.11. Georgia's right near Florida at 1.10, and New York is at 1.10, so New York State is up there again. Arkansas is not looking good. California is at 1.08. Also Nevada, 1.07. Well, I won't read through all of them, but you get the picture. So let me go back to your comments. So Biden was in Florida today. Yes. Steve says, I'm watching Citizen4. Wow, just wow. And Steve said, but did Biden know it was Florida? Steve says, Biden thinks he's running for the Senate against George Bush. Carmen says, I think he did slip up and say that he was running for the Senate. Steve says, twice. Carmen says, oh no. Carmen says that most restaurants have adapted to takeout only, right? I don't know if they've adapted to takeout only. They could probably do takeout only, but some restaurants have been open here for dine-in with following social distance guidelines. Okay, and they've been doing that. I personally wouldn't be caught dead in such a restaurant. We did go to a restaurant in June that has an outdoor thing, and we went there and just had a pizza. Okay, and I promptly caught a virus and had a case of diarrhea. And that's the last time we've been to a restaurant. It was back in June, and it was the last time. I mean, I just said, it isn't worth it. I just cook at home. But generally speaking, what I cook at home is better than what we get at restaurants anyway. Bonnie's shaking her head. Yeah. So I might as well buy the stuff and cook it at home. I'm usually a pretty fast cook, and I really like to cook anyway, so that's cool. So, but anyway, there are restaurants here that are doing takeout actually very well. Some expensive dishes, on takeout that are cooked well and that, are worthwhile. And Cora Emanuel says, not in New York. Steve Wolfbrand says, sounds like the election will be total chaos. Well, I think in some states that's going to be the case. I don't think it's going to be chaos in all states because some states are locked up for one party, or the other, and it won't be close. And so in those states, probably there aren't going to be disputes. Carr says, I came in later, we discussed Democrats kicking Greens off the ballot. No, we haven't, but they certainly kicked Greens off the ballot. For example, I don't think they kicked them off in this state, but Greens never did get on the ballot in this state. So we didn't have the option of voting Green this time. Carmen says, people are on some dumb defiant mode and are for Adolf because they think that he is not establishment. And Kay says, stupid is as stupid goes, Carmen. I think the saying was stupid is as stupid does, wasn't it? Carmen says, it's mad psychosis, Dr. Joe. Mental illness is real bad in the U.S. Right now we have the age of the narcissist and defiant voters are delusional. Steve says, to answer your question, Doc, the Democrats are just as bad. Just as bad? No, they're not just as bad. They're not suppressing the vote. What they did in the primaries, well, they suppressed the vote in some places and they manipulated the voting machines, in other places. But as far as general election voting is concerned, they do not suppress the vote.
With a gun?
And they don't suppress the vote by intimidating voters with loaded guns. Kay says, yes, Carmen, I was trained to see that years ago when I worked at the old state mental hospital. Carmen said, easier said than done when the very president is emboldening racists, amosexuals, just willing to kill. Amosexuals, huh? Steve says, was Carmen a patient? Wow, thanks. I just read a few articles and watched some videos and came up with that assessment. Carmen says, Steve Wolfbrand, no, you were, still are. Kay says, I worked on the male crisis ward there, so I was taught many useful things back then. Steve says, that ward has moved to the sidewalks in my neighborhood. Kay says, I was so pissed when Reagan closed them all. Shake my head. Best job I ever had. Never boring for sure. Laugh out loud. Kay says, actually, Steve, that was when homelessness started everywhere. Yeah, that was when it got big, actually. It was because Reagan turned people out into the street. Yes. And Steve said, yes, it was indeed. And Carmen says, Adolf bullies the rest of the world. He's not going to care what they say. Carmen says, I don't get high, but maybe they ought to legalize weed. We're going to need it. Carmen says, getting rid of bar is instrumental. Evelina says, people are drinking enough as it is. Steve says, nah, Doc. They never prosecute former presidents. It's an unwritten agreement. If they did, they would all be in jail, except for Jimmy Carter. Well, I don't know who they is, but I think Letitia James in New York State is going to prosecute Donald Trump. She's the Attorney General of New York. She's very zealous. She's going after him now. She has a great deal of integrity, and there can be all the unwritten agreements in the world. She is not a party to them. Now, whether she'll become a party, I don't know. But it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. Now, he may be able to make an agreement at the federal level that Biden will not have his attorney general prosecute Trump. So Trump then won't have to worry about that. But of course, if Trump should stay in Florida, in the United States, then Letitia James is going to extradite him from Florida. You know that would happen in that case. So in order to avoid prosecution by the state of New York, Trump might have to go live in a foreign country. Of course, he has hotels in foreign countries, so go live in one of his hotels and run things from there. Kay says, 2 of my guys killed themselves rather than lose the only home they had that worked for them. One hung himself on the transfer ward because they weren't watching him like we told them to, and the other jumped from the top of the huge water tower out there. Wow. Evelina says, that just makes me angry. And Kay says, but just imagine how pissed I was, Evelina Pont. Those guys were like family to me. Evelina said they were fortunate to have you. My charge nurse told me the ward had never been so peaceful before I came there to work. I just treated them like friends and family. They always had my back too when I needed help. Steve said they boarded up the glass doors at the local CVS again. They must be expecting trouble. Carmen says, written Hitler. Deborah Wilson says, I'm so agitated, trying to stay grounded. My hubby and I are at loggerheads. It's no fun. Oh, you shouldn't be at loggerheads. You shouldn't let it get into the family. You should find a way to keep it out of the family. It's not what should be happening. Carmen says, they don't give a damn about the people, but boy, they care about those corporations and protecting those drugs. Steve says, over politics. And Evelina says, stay grounded. Sometimes it means standing back a little, though. Good luck, Deborah. I hear you. Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrand, what isn't politics anymore, Steve? Steve Gonzo says, Trump campaign tells Minnesota Police Union to get retired cops to be poll challengers. Oh, boy. If there is violence, this is going to be on Trump's head. Trump is he's in the process of causing civil war in the United States. That is what he is doing. The potential is there. And he is just revving up that potential all the time with each passing day, with his constant remarks and encouragement of violence. Carmen says, FTP. Challenges but to harass voters, Steve Gonzo says K. Clearly, Carmen says, probably wearing spyware to identify Democrat voters once full fascism kicks in. Dirty-faced Chad Wolf is still here. Carmen says, we're going to need the resistance. Steve says, this is going to get ugly. Kay says, but Joshua Kahn Russell was on the Majority Report today, on YouTube today, talking about that. He's the one who was on but no Miki Const talking about that. Check it out. I did check it out. I did see Joshua Kahn Russell on the Nomi Key show. Steve Gonzo says, but gives a link to Ross' story. Trump campaign tells the Minnesota Police Union to get retired cops to be poll challengers. Carmen says, we're in the Handmaid's Tale right now. People just refuse to see it. Carmen says, and DeJoy still capitalized off of the fiasco and was awarded a multi-million-dollar contract. I'm going to shake my head. Just because he's got a multi-million-dollar contract doesn't mean he'll keep the multi-million contract. One of the first things that Biden can do when he gets into office is to revoke any multi-million-dollar contract that was given to DeJoy and his company. Kay says, for the last 40 years, our government has been taking away our rights for a little bit of time that people younger than me don't realize what was taken before they were old enough to work and vote. Steve says, at my job, we were getting checks via postal service that were sent about 3 weeks ago. Yeah, I guess that's a real problem out in California. We haven't been having such a problem here in Virginia. It seems like our postal service is pretty normal. The bills are arriving on time to be paid. They're a bit late, but they're arriving on time, to be paid. And Deborah says, our dispute is, of course, over Joe Biden. Gag, puke. Yeah. So, is he for Joe Biden? Okay, and you, Deborah, just say gag, puke. If that's what's at issue, then look, you each ought to vote as your conscience dictates. That's all. He shouldn't be having a problem with that. Carmen says, the only ones that have the courage to mass protest is BLM. Everyone else is too comfortable. I don't know. If it gets really bad and we see those people trying to take over by force of arms, I think a lot of people will be motivated to get out and protest. And you won't realize how many till it's going on. I think Washington's going to be flooded in that instance. Steve says, the Biden crime family is compromised and extremely corrupt, as well the Obamas. I'm sure the Obamas are. Except I don't know if they have to be corrupt anymore. They're just cashing in now as private citizens, right? Stacy says, I trust my local board of elections because I know the guy that runs it. He is remarkable. That's great. Kay says, the main idea the GOP had in the 80s was to keep both adults so busy working and taking care of their kids they had no time to pay attention to what was happening to them. Carmen says, what region or state? Stacy says, Frederick County, Maryland. We almost moved to Frederick County, Maryland, Stacy, but our grandchildren were here, so we moved here instead when we last moved. Carmen says, thank you, encouraging. Stacy said, that's just my county. I have a feeling things aren't great in Baltimore City and possibly Baltimore County. Shit's pretty deep red west of here, so all bets, are off. And Steve said, the Russians did it all. Carmen says, go away. Stop distracting the narrative with your need for attention. Steve says, I love you too. Evelina says, wait a minute. I scrolled too far. Evelina says, there already civil and institutional violence. Don't think one day would be all that different. No. By the way, the world already knows what's happening. I've read in different sites. They're also pretty realistic about what will happen and not happen after the elections. Yeah, they might be realistic, but they might not be realistic. You know, I mean, people are given to flights of fancy and to charging everybody else with not being realistic. Carmen says, at least Evo is going home on November 9th. He's going home on November 9th. I hope it's safe. Evelina says, not a lot of hope there, I'm afraid. I noticed, by the way, today there were protests in La Paz, right-wing protests, okay, in La Paz. These right-wingers thought the election was fraudulent, and the fraud was committed by Yanin Áñez. So they selected the right-wing neo-fascists as the source of the election fraud in favor, okay, of Evo. And these people, they were rich kids and rich grown-ups. There were a fair amount of young people, okay, among them. And they were fairly well-off people. And they were out, and they were demonstrating. And they were making obscene remarks. And they were jumping up and down. Okay, and they said that anybody who fails to jump up and down is a, and then they called such people an obscene name, which I will not repeat here on this family show. Anyway, that was the first protest I'd seen by the wingers. The first one by the Bolivian wingers. So it may not be so safe for Evo after all. We may have to watch that carefully as the days go by. See if they're preparing the way for another military coup, who would then turn the country over to Áñez again, right? Stacy says, I hate the word the shenanigans. It implies a minor infraction of tease, like taking a bite out of your cookie, not actually denying one's votes to count. Yes, I agree. Okay, it is a euphemism for committing a crime in this case. Evelina says, hope so. Steve Wolfbrand says, you're talking about a military coup, Doc. No other way to say it. I'm talking about a military coup by who? If you think I'm talking about a military coup in the case of a military intervention to uphold the Constitution, I don't think that is necessarily a military coup unless the military decides to begin to rule. As long as the military continues to respect what the Congress does and confines itself to getting rid of a president who's attempting a coup, I would not say that that is a military coup. I would call it defending the Constitution. Steve says, that's a bunch of malarkey, laugh out loud. What's a bunch? What's a bunch of malarkey, Steve? Carmen says, thanks for looking that up for me, Dr. Joe. Evelina says, do you want that, though, Steve? Evelina clarifies and says, a military coup, I mean. Steve says, at this point, I really don't know. Carmen says, Egolf insulted the military quite a bit, didn't he? I hope they don't forget. Stacy says, I've not dined in anywhere. I do fast food and Chipotle, and mostly I cook. Carmen says, I love Europe because they always have outdoor dining and very little bugs. Evelina said, did you hear Jeremy Corbyn was suspended from the Labour Party on allegations of anti-Semitism? But can you believe it? The way I heard it is that they issued a report with allegations, of anti-Semitism, and Corbyn replied with a defense of himself, and he replied with a bunch of true statements, and it was in reply to those true statements that they kicked him out of the Labour Party. Is what I heard. I don't know whether it was a suspension or they expelled him. But I don't know. I hope he's strong enough to split up the Labour Party because I think the people who are running the Labour Party now do not have the support of the rank and file, the Labour Party, that they just they recently conducted basically a coup against Jeremy Corbyn. But anyway, yes, I remarked about that at the beginning of the show, Evelina, I think before you arrived. I had heard about it. It was covered on David Bedowell's program today. Stacey Van Veen said, and now I'm fat. And Gina Marie is here. Hi, Gina Marie. And Cora said, I do most of the cooking too, Joe. Evelina says, I cook. But Gina Marie says, I am the only Italian that can't cook well, nor do I like to. Well, I've been learning over a period of years. I've learned how to cook pasta halfway well, I think, and I think I can make some pretty mean sauces too. And Bonnie makes a mean pesto sauce. Carmen says same, and I can't blame the restaurants either because I never eat out. Stace says I make a killer Alfredo. Well, we're on a dairy-free diet, mostly a dairy-free diet anyway. So what I do for Alfredo is I use coconut cream in order to replace the normal cream. It makes a pretty good sauce, actually. Karma says, one of my favorites. And Gina Marie says, I don't think anything can be as bad as Trump, can it? Has anyone been as bad as Trump? I'm not sure what you mean by as bad, as Trump. No president of the United States has been as bad as Trump in terms of trying to overthrow the Constitution of the United States, and in terms of saying that he was going to fail to accept the results of the Electoral College vote. No one has been as bad. Evelina said, asks whether Bush 43 was as bad. And the answer to that question is he was worse in some ways than Trump, and he was better, in some ways. How was he worse? He was worse in going to war with Iraq when there was no reason to go to war with Iraq. He was worse in turning the war in Afghanistan into a nation-building project when he stated at the outset that it wasn't going to be a nation-building project. He and his attorney general were pretty bad also when it came to various things they tried to do in the federal government, especially with respect to the Patriot Act and the applications of that act. Trump, on the other hand, was very bad when it came to drone killings. He was very bad in the applications of the Patriot Act. He's been extremely bad in cruelty to all manner of people, okay, including immigrants, but just about to every minority group in the country, and just overthrowing all of the norms that were important to the functioning of the system. Stacy says, Trump is obvious about it. SCOTUS is rather heinous in most of Congress. Yes, it's true. Evelina says, Bush Jr. was the worst for me. Stacy says, Trump, Miller, Sessions, Barr, etc. Need to go before Den Haag, the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Carmen says, yep. Letitia is going after Agar for like Wonder Woman, Amazon style. Steve says his father was worse. Right, but what his father did was all secret, so nobody knew. We still don't know what his father did. Exactly. Carmen said, I hope Scotland doesn't let him in when he tries to run with his tail between his legs.
There isn't much of a tail.
There isn't much of a tailbone, he says. He can probably get into the Philippines where his buddy Duterte is there. He probably even has a hotel there. Okay, maybe his buddy from Turkey will take him in. Isn't he supposed to be getting a hotel in Turkey? Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrandt, I became an expat because of him. It's personal. Oh, because of Bush? Oh, you became an expat because of Bush? Or you became an expat from Argentina because of Bush? Evelina says, saw the towers fall abroad. Steve says, inside job. Kay asked, Evelina, do you think you'll ever come back here? Evelina says, while abroad, earth-shattering for me. Steve says, Glenn Greenwald resigned. I know he did. It was a courageous thing to do. And what happened with Greenwald, they tried to censor his stuff. The editor at The Intercept, or the editors, the team of editors, tried to censor his stuff. He was writing a story about Hunter Biden, okay, and Joe Biden. He was covering that. And they didn't want him to cover it, I guess, so soon before the election. So they censored it. And that was, to hear him tell it, it was a violation of his contract. And so he quit, and I presume he's going to sue them for breach of contract. And he's gone over to Substack now, and he's blogging at Substack. And probably he's going to be talking with a number of friends of us all, who are working at Substack, okay, with their blogs about forming a new organization, and they're going to go out and look for financial support for a new news organization. Kay says, good. When you do, I hope to meet you in person, Evelina. Evelina says, and Steve says, I'm thinking of getting out, probably Mexico. But Evelina says, when I sell my apartment. And Kay says, so glad I met you in this chat, Evelina. Evelina says, would love to meet you in person, Kay. Steve says, you can buy a ghost gun on the internet. They send you the parts to assemble. No serial number, JS. Evelina says they've just killed a union leader in Bolivia. Wonderful. Luis Luis Gutierrez of the Miners Union. Steve Wolfbrand said the positivity rate in Idaho is 35%. Okay, according to a report I heard. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the positivity rate. The RT, okay, in Idaho, which is the rate, okay, of reproduction of the virus, is, I don't think, anywhere near there. Let's see, Iowa. So I don't know what you mean by the positivity rate, but the RT is 1.12, okay, in Idaho, far from the worst. Wyoming is the worst at 1.34. Vermont is also at 1.34. So they're in a tie for the worst. So, Kay says, all kinds of violence all over this world now. Shake my head. And Gina Marie says, laugh out loud. Evelina says, yep. Steve Gonzo said, holding a Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. Idaho's rogue Lieutenant Governor Janice Janice McGeachin appeared in the video from an anti-lockdown group that declared it will ignore any state emergency orders that it believes violates people's rights. Well, maybe the militias will be busy in Idaho. I wouldn't mind that at all. Steve Gonzo says, holding a Bible in one hand and a pistol in the other. Idaho's rogue Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin appeared in a video from an anti-lockdown group. I read that already. Stacy says, it's funny, I thought Corbyn was Jewish. I had no idea of the context, okay, of the allegations. The allegations are totally untrue. Jeremy Corbyn is the furthest thing from an anti-Semite, okay, that you can get. Now, he has been critical, okay, of Israel. What they've been doing over in the UK is conflating criticism of Israel. I won't even say opposition to Israel because it's opposition to the government of Israel. I don't think it's opposition to Israel in Corbyn's case. But he's spoken favorably about Palestinian rights, and he's been critical of the policies, okay, of the Israeli state, which is no more than I've done myself. Corbyn is not Jewish. I am Jewish. Okay. Just for the record, okay. Corbyn is not at all an anti-Semite. His enemies, especially his enemies in the Labour Party, but of course the Tories have been gleefully joining in and for years have been spreading rumors that he's an anti-Semite. And the Jewish groups, okay, or many of the Jewish groups, okay, in the UK have been cooperating in this because there are Jewish people who like to conflate opposition to the activities of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, so that they weaponize anti-Semitism against certain political figures. And that's the context of what was happening to Corbyn. They've been doing it for years. I think that Corbyn is a great guy. He made a political error, though. Okay, his political error was that he tried to straddle the line between staying in the EU, okay, and Brexit. Okay, some in his party wanted to Brexit. Some in his party wanted to stay in the EU. And he couldn't put forward a clear policy. He did not put forward a clear policy. And for that reason, the Labour Party was defeated, okay, in the last election, okay, in the Brexit election. After they were defeated, he lost power. He wasn't able to retain his power, okay, as leader, okay, of the party. And that opened the way for these people to purge him from the party. The new people who took over are neoliberal bastards. And that's what's been happening over in the Labour Party. Corbyn was trying to shift the Labour Party back to a democratic socialist party, as it had been back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And they were fighting him over that. That's what happened. Steve Gonzo said, same old Zionist ploy. I don't know if I would even say that, because there are Zionists, okay, and there are Zionists. Okay, my family was Zionist as I was growing up, but they were never in favor of violating Palestinian rights. That's a separate issue. That's a separate question. It's not about the state of Israel per se. It's about the policies that are getting followed by this particular government of Israel. Okay, says, Yum Pesto, send me some Bonnie. I used to make that too when I had a garden. Carmen says, how do you break the mass psychosis trance? Okay, trance of maggots before it's too late. But the best way to break the mass psychosis trance is for Trump to be soundly defeated, heavily defeated, because the maggots don't care for losers. They're like Trump. They don't care for losers. The best way is to make Trump a loser. Kay says, no real way to do that, Carmen. Steve says, everyone should watch the Snowden documentary, Citizen4, on YouTube. It's free. It is. Evelyn says, like a fever, it will pass. Carmen says, ha, no tail Trump. Yeah, well, and Melania agrees. Carmen says, well, will it spread? Evelina says, but what do you think? But Dr. Joe, American expat, of course. What do I think, okay, of becoming, okay, an expat? Okay, I think for us, it's too late. We are in the 80s now, and we have, okay, our grandchildren here. We don't have any money to travel. We have actually very little money, okay, for our old age. We're dependent on Social Security. And so I don't think we could scrape together what it would take to to go to another country. I think for a variety of reasons. We're going to have to live it out. And I think that means fight it out here in the United States. And Evelina says, Carmen Muniz, just don't catch it. But laugh out loud. Kay says, not sure if it will spread, but you can fix the narcissists. And Cora says, Reagan was the worst. He established the foundation of the downward spiral into fascism we see today. Yes, in that sense, he was the worst. He was the foundation. Stacy said, the ray gun and Nutti, yes. Yes, Nutti greatly contributed. But also, so did Bill Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton also contributed because he was a neoliberal par excellence. Ray Gun and Clinton. Evelina Pont, heck no, been drinking bleach and snorting Lysol. JK. Steve Gonzo says, AI pack. APAC. Yeah. Evelina says, this is true, Cora. Carmen Muniz, no, don't do that. To laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo came in, but didn't say anything I can see. Evelina said, such a kidder, Carmen. Stacey said, I'm not keen on ISR's government either. Carmen Muniz said, just a silly goose, laugh out loud. And Carmen said, Corin is probably just an APAC. No, I don't think he's an APAC. Evelina said, thanks for standing up for Jeremy, Dr. Joe. I really liked Corbyn. I thought he would have made a great prime minister for the UK. It's too bad they passed him up. They keep on voting for the Tories, even as the Tories even attack the National Health Service and start to break up the National Health Service. Stacey says, I'm an infidel. My father's mother was a Levy, and that is where my Jewish line ends. Well, I'm not religious myself, but still, okay, I ethnically identify strongly. I ethnically identify strongly. And Kay says, people in Jerusalem are protesting to get Netanyahu out of office almost every day. And she inquires whether it's spelling. Yeah, the correct spelling is Y-A-H-U, but personally, I've always referred to him as the Yahoo myself. So Netanyahu, spelled just that way, is just fine with me. He is a fucking Yahoo. Evelina says, yeah, but JC wanted an updated referendum, that's all. Wasn't that fair? Wasn't that fair to you? He wanted a referendum after years, the original. No, I don't think it was fair because there was, a referendum. The UK public voted at that time to leave the Union. It was up to the government to implement it, and the government never implemented it. It seemed to me it was the obligation of the first government to have power to implement it. And by the way, it was the job of the opposition itself to respect it and to say the will of the voters was that we ought to get out. And so Labour should have been harrying the Conservatives who were in power at that time to get out, and should have said to the Conservatives, you have our support for implementing the referendum because that's the way the people voted and we respect democracy. So no, I don't think it was fair. It was unfair for the British government not to have implemented the Brexit vote, and it's still unfair. And there shouldn't be another referendum until the will of the people is respected by implementing the first one. Evelina said wanted to guard against a no-deal exit. Well, if you're in power in the British system, okay, in a parliamentary system, then you have the power to guard against a no-deal exit. But if you're not in the majority, then you don't. So try to get into the majority first. Tell people that you're for Brexit, and if they want to see a good Brexit, they ought to vote for you. But he never did that. Evelina says, I'm an expat, Dr. Joe. But yes, Evelina, but are you an expat from here or are you an expat from Argentina? Somehow I got the impression that you were an expat from Argentina. Perhaps I got that impression because you know so much about Argentina. And Kay says, I hate both Clintons. They ruined the Dem Party and this country. They helped. The Bushes helped too. I think the Bushes and the Clintons were in collusion for many years. Evelina says them too. Carmen says, the United Kingdom has the same delusional syndrome as the U.S. Must have something to do with white privilege or classism. I don't know. I don't know why other classes keep on voting for upper-class Tory snobs. I don't know. Steve Gonzo says, think that's the Golden Gate Bridge? We went over this last time. It looks like the Empire State Building is up there, or maybe it's the Chrysler Building. Doesn't look like the San Francisco skyline. I think that might be the Brooklyn Bridge, but I'm not sure. We went over that last time. Bonnie is pointing at her watch. That means she wants my company. And I'm almost done, honey. I'm really almost done. I'm only 3 minutes behind at this point. I saw somewhere where Netanyahu and his wife bring their dirty laundry when they travel here. But literally, like they're home from college. They bring their dirty laundry and then they stay over at the Kushner's house, right? Where they used to stay. Evelina says they didn't implement Brexit for how long, though, Dr. Joe? For quite a long time. For quite a long time. I don't know, 3 years, wasn't it? Hanging fire for 3 years? But if you're going to have a referendum, you have to obey the results of a referendum. If you don't want to do that, you don't have the referendum. Implement the first of the referendums first. Then if the UK wants to rejoin the Union at that time, people change their minds, they can always go back and ask to be admitted again. Who knows? Maybe the Europeans would love to have them. Or maybe they could do very well with their own currency outside of Europe. I mean, maybe they could do things for the working class in the UK for a change. Steve Gonzo said, Israel first. Evelina says, American expat, Dr. Joe. So where are you now, Evelina? Anyway, that was the last of the comments. Kay says, well, thank you for another great discussion. I live for these. I love you all. We love you too, Kay. Evelina says, expatted, laugh out loud. And also Dolores says, thank you and good night. And Steve says, my father liberated, but book involved. Well, Steve, I thank you. I thank your father. Steve says, 2020, nothing's written in stone. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night. Good night, Steve. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. I will see you next on Saturday night. Same time, same station. I posted 2 short takes today. I will try to post some other short takes on tomorrow or Saturday. Carmen says, thanks for being so tolerant of us, Barney. And thanks, Dr. Joe. No Hulk moments tonight. Hugs. Oh, God, I got to have a Hulk moment. Steve said he didn't like to talk about it. I'm sure he did. I'm sure it was awful. Awful to see it, especially in person. I mean, we've seen enough of the pictures and stuff like that. As it happens, I had some relatives, in Buchenwald, who lived through it, and I had some other relatives who died there. Stacy said, same bat channel. Yeah, same bat channel. Okay, good night, folks.